If you remember, last week we spent time in the first half of Romans chapter 13. What's the subject matter of chapter 13? Do you remember? I realize you've slept 7 times, but what's Romans 13 about? Pardon? That was last chapter, 12. Very good. I mean, you get partial credit on that, but submission to the government. What chapter 13 talks about, and don't go away, I forgot to save my place. I guess I could write it in blood, but kind of squeamish. Chapter 13 talks about our responsibilities to government, and the second half talks about our responsibilities to the community, or the members of the community. Okay. And he starts out in chapter 13, of course, talking about the government. We're going to zip through the first half of the chapter just to bring us up to speed. There's also something I wanted to cover in that. But it talks about our responsibilities to government. Now, Paul is writing to the Roman congregation, and he's talking to them about how they need to acknowledge and respect and obey the sitting government, which at the time was what? Roman Empire. Who was the emperor of the Roman Empire? Nero was the emperor. Good guy or bad guy? He comes under the category of bad guy, probably in the top 10. He was noted for his debauchery, and what he produced, I guess you could call bad government. But it was government that Paul said you have to respect and you have to obey. He says there in the first couple of verses, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. So a government gets their authority from whom? The Lord. Their authority comes from the Lord, is what Paul is saying. That does not mean that God approves of what the government does. That only means that God permits what the government does. There's a big difference between permission and approval. They don't have his approval by any means, but they have his permission. And by having his permission, that means they have his authority to operate. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. He goes on in that chapter, he says, for rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Paul says, do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. Now, that's not an absolute, having praise from the government. That is a general thought, because obviously Christians 100% do not receive praise from the government 100% of the time. Many times the government actually opposes the ethics and the beliefs of the church and the Christian. But he does say, for it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, and rightfully so. That's what they're there for, is to punish evil and to protect those who do not commit evil. For it is a minister of God, remember, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Now, remember the close of chapter 12? When Paul quoted from the Old Testament, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, not ours. We do not take revenge. God, we leave that to God. Now, part of the way he does that is government, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. What does he mean for conscience sake? We obey the government, why? Because God expects us to, and we know that. And so if we fail to do so, what should it produce in us? A guilty conscience is what Paul is saying. Now, what Paul has done in these first 5 verses of chapter 13, he's kind of given us, now in logic it's called an if-then statement. That is, I don't know, having had to take so much math, I also had to take logic. If something is true, then there's a conclusion. Then, therefore, the conclusion becomes true. In chapter 13's case, what Paul has said in those 5 verses gives us kind of an if-then. If you respect God, then what? Then you will respect who? Then you will respect government. Then you can't even spell the 3-letter word. Will respect the government. Now, that's what Paul says. Do we know that to be a true statement? Yes, that's what he says in those first 5 verses. If you respect God, then you will respect government. True statement? True statement. That's what Paul says. If we were to back up and go back to verse 3, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. Where does that authority come from? From God. And if we properly respect God, then we should properly respect the government. Now, what's a little scary is that's an if-then statement, and it's a true statement. What then also becomes true is what is called the contrapositive of that statement. That is, if P, then Q. And that's what we have. We have the P statement and the Q statement. What is also true in that is if not Q, then not P. The contrapositive of this statement is, if we do not respect government, then what? We do not respect God. And I go through that because we will get into this in different forms later in the chapter. But that's what he's saying. He expects us to obey the government. In the case of the Christians in Rome, that would be tough to do. That would be tough to do. Particularly the Jewish Christians in the congregation in Rome, because of what Rome was doing and about to do to their own homeland. So that becomes, for those Christians, this becomes tough to do. But if they truly respect God, they will. If they fail to respect the government, it's the same as saying they fail to respect God. And we can't be in that particular position. But that's what Paul's saying. Now, Paul will get into other subjects where this is also true statements that we have to be careful about. Going on in Romans, in 1 Peter, Peter saying much the same that Paul said, keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good works, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. That's going to happen. We obey the government because we respect God. There will be those who oppose what we're trying to do. And what Peter says is, if you remain faithful, you glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. So Peter is emulating what Paul says, that we may not agree, we may think it's a bad decision, we may know it's immoral, and that causes us consternation and internal conflict, but Paul says obey the government. Yes, the government may be committing things that we consider immoral. Does that happen today? Do we participate? We can't participate in the sin, but do we still respect the government? Chapter 14. Good thought. That's an excellent segue. So you're way ahead of me there, Tyler. Did they disobey the government? Did the Christians, let's take for a specific example, did the Christians in Rome disobey the government? No, they didn't. Were they still persecuted by the government? Yes, they were. Why didn't they disobey why did they continue to assemble even though the Roman government forbid it? Because they respected God. They respected God. Let's take an example. You've been on the highway. What do you notice about traffic on the highway? Do they honor the speed limit? No. I would say there is a general disregard for the speed limit. Is the speed limit law? Yes, it is. It's state law. Why is it there? Because the state considers it to be the safe way to operate a motor vehicle. But when you're on the highway, what do you notice about traffic? Most of it is, you don't see any cars or trucks, you see blurs. Because there's a general disregard for the speed limit on the highway. There is a lack of respect for the law. And if there's a lack of respect for the law, what could you say about that? There is a lack of respect for God. Now, the law makes, the state makes laws regarding speed limit. That's the law. That's what we as Christians have to honor. And if we fail to honor by choice, who are we failing to honor? The bottom line is we're failing to honor God. Now, you get on the highway, and it can be pretty scary. I know I've made a number of drivers really irritated them. I can see it in my rearview mirror. But there is a reason that speed limit is there. Clay's not here. We're very familiar with, Clay and I have seen over and over again, pileups that amount to 20, 30, 50 cars. On one day, I had 2 pileups, each of them 50-car pileups, less than a mile apart. It was a rather busy day. The primary cause was speeding. Drivers going too fast. There is a reason why there's a state law. And it is up to Christians to respect the government by respecting the speed limit. And if Christians disregard the speed limit and go as fast as they want, who is Paul saying they're actually showing disrespect for? For God himself. Now, there are times in traffic, I'll give you that, where if you go the speed limit, you become an obstacle. And you have to consider that, and you have to accommodate that without violating what? Your conscience, without violating your conscience. If you violate your conscience, you're as wrong as if you went too fast. Very complicated. the man who wrote those words, life got very complicated for him. Because in just a few years, this government that he told him to obey is going to execute him according to tradition. But he still, and there's no doubt in my mind, Paul knew it was coming. Yet Paul still says this. So what choice do we have? Janine.
Government there for everybody. We have many, many, many levels of government, many who are in authority above the others.
Yes, that's called federal.
This is the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
What they ruled on our worship. They said California was wrong. Now, what do we do there?
Okay, who made the law? No, California made the law. The state makes the law. Now, in that case, the federal government overruled them. But until the federal government overrules them, what's the Christian's responsibility? Honor the law. We've got to honor the law. We're not the Supreme Court. We can't make decisions. We can't choose to overrule a law. In this case, we're fortunate in that we have a form of government where we have an arm of government that can overrule, the judicial section of government. They can overrule what the legislature passes. And as such, if once they do, then that law is now null and void. But until the Supreme Court makes the ruling, what are we bound to? We're bound to the law. If Nero had changed his mind, then Christians wouldn't have been executed. But he didn't. And yet Paul says they're still bound to the law. That's his point. That's what Paul is saying. That you may live, part of living faithfully is properly respecting God. And if you properly respect God, you therefore properly respect the law. And it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference whether we disagree with it, whether we consider it bad laws, whether we consider it immoral. What Randy talked about earlier today, when he talked about, I remember one of the points was abortion. I don't want to see my tax dollars going there. Do I have a choice? Not if I properly respect God. That's one of those decisions that government makes that I hate. But I have, if I properly respect God, then I will properly respect the government. If I disobey the government, who am I showing disrespect for? Ultimately to God. And that's the point. That's the point that Paul is making. Why do we, according to Peter, why do we obey the law though we don't agree with it? What did he say? What does he say in first verse? Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. That's why we do it. The second reason why we do it. First reason, because we respect God. Second reason, because we hope that we are glorifying God in the eyes of those who see us. Did I miss a hand or anything?
Until, as we asked last week, until that law goes against what God says we're supposed to do. Acts chapter 4.
That's correct.
We should obey man or God.
That's correct. When Peter, let's go to Acts chapter 4. Pardon? Oh, okay. Let's go to Acts chapter 4. Peter, we find Peter where? Where's Peter? He's not in jail yet. In Acts chapter 4, what you're talking about. He's before the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish council, which is the Jewish government. That's where Peter is. Now, as such, in verse 15, but when they had ordered them to leave the council, they began to confer with one another, saying, what shall we do with these men? For the fact that a noteworthy miracle has taken place, through them is apparent to all who live in Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. They knew what Peter was doing. Not only was he preaching the gospel, he was performing miracles. Good government or bad government? That's bad government. Bad government. But so that it will not spread any further among the people, let us warn them to speak no longer to any man in that name. That's what they were forbidding. They were forbidding Peter and the other apostles to preach the gospel. Them they commanded them not to teach, speak, or teach at all in the name of Jesus. Now, that's when Peter says, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than God, you be the judge. Peter had to disobey that commandment because he had to preach the gospel. What about the rest of the laws that Peter was subject to? Did he throw out the baby with the bathwater? Did he then start disobeying all the laws? No, he continued to obey all the laws. The one law that he had to disobey was the one that forbid preaching, and that's the only one that we have record that he did disobey, because the government had targeted a primary duty of the Christian. Now, if the government targets a primary duty of the Christian, what do we have to do? Then we have to do what Peter did. We have to obey God rather than men. Is that the case today? Has government targeted Christians? We might say yes, but we don't know. That's just speculation on our part. There's political speculation all running rampant right now. But can we say for a fact that government has targeted Christians? No, we cannot. In the case that we're going through all the pandemic COVID problems right now, and they restricted the assembly of Christians, of churches in general. Why did they do that? It's because of the spread of coronavirus. Now, why were churches forbidden to assemble as they had before? Yes, we are. Yes, we are. We are subject to the law as modified by the Supreme Court. What law are we subject to with regards to the pandemic? State law. State law. Under a declaration of emergency, the governor has the additional powers. And one of the powers is he restricts the size of, we say churches, but what he is doing is he is restricting the size of public assemblies. Now, that's the law, public assemblies. Why is churches in there? Because a church is a public assembly. But in the case of the Supreme Court, what the Supreme Court has done is take churches out of the public the assembly and made a special case for the sake of churches. So they're not targeting churches. In other words, what they're doing is they're relaxing the law for one particular case, and that's churches. It's not the context in which we find Peter speaking to the council. So we can't use Peter's words in our particular situation because the government has not targeted churches. Now, if the government came along and said, public assemblies can meet like they always have, except for churches, now what do we have? Now we got the situation that Peter was in, because the congregation, Christians, would then be targeted by the government, whereas right now Christians and churches are getting special consideration by the government. You see how that works? So we read what Peter says, and that applied to Peter before the council, but that doesn't apply to us today. if, like I said, they said public assemblies could meet as usual, but not churches. Now we got the situation that Peter's in. Now his words would apply to us. But we got to look at the context. And Peter's context was entirely different from what we're facing. Richard.
Preaching, it was for healing the sick that Peter brought up before you. Back previously, before verse 12 and verse 8, I think it is, that Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to the rulers and elders of the people, if we are on trial today for a benefit done to a sick man, as to how this man has been made well. And then 2 verses later, he makes the comment. But I don't know. I'm hearing a lot of different things in relationship to speeding. You brought up first. In relationship, okay, I'm doing 66 and a 65. I'm speeding. I'm doing 100 in a 65. The fine is going to be a lot greater for that than it is this of the 66. Now, I'm not trying to make a comparison that you can just pay the fine because that doesn't coincide with if you murder someone, I'll just go to jail. Those are the consequences. The bottom line is, ultimately, you're still going to have to answer to God. And
Yes.
no matter what you do, you made the comment about, if I don't go a little bit faster, I'm going to get run over. Does that, in and of itself, make it so that it's acceptable? I don't know if we're going to take this literal in Romans 13th chapter and Peter, 1 Peter 2.
That's probably why chapter 13 with chapter 14. But is a judge going to throw you in jail for going 66 and a 65? Will a judge throw you in jail for going 66 in a 65 mile per hour zone? No. It's, that's not a reasonable. I can go 66 and not know it. Okay. We'll bump it 67 and a half, but that's as high as we go. Justin, and then Robert. Okay.
66 is breaking the speed limit, then you're breaking the law. Period. I can't. Or 66, you break the law. Is what Mr. point.
Yes, but then comes into play. Chapter 14 talks about the conscience. No. Yes, it can. Does your 65 and 66, that's splitting hairs. There's no reason for discussing that because no judge is going to hold you accountable. You change the tires on your car, it's going to change your speedometer. You go downhill and you don't realize it, it's going to change your speedometer. You get a tailwind, it's going to change your the speed you're going. So it's up to you to control it. And that's where I leave it up to your conscience. Now, at some point, you choose to speed, and your conscience tells you you're doing something wrong, then what have you done? You're not respecting the government. Well, we don't want to split hairs because we end up wasting time. Roger.
We're not supposed to forsake the assembly, right?
Correct.
Right. So right now we have the Supreme Court that has more concerns than the liberals. So there's different opinions on the Supreme Court. Some would have upheld the California, and the other ones didn't agree. And amongst the ones that did agree, but some would not have any of them
while we couldn't assemble until we worked out how can we assemble in accordance with the law. And it was a few weeks later that we figured it out. And then we assembled once again. Now, there were still restrictions. There were still restrictions, not on churches, on public assemblies. That's what the government was concerned about. We have to make sure that we keep it apples to apples, oranges to oranges.
They ruled that the churches, we couldn't meet. Okay, if they said the churches can't meet.
Now, they said
Assemblies can't meet. Oh, okay.
Symbols despite what the government said, is that not correct?
right.
I'm assuming what you're talking about is where they've targeted Christians and churches. Mm-hmm. Right. That's where we're in the context in which Peter was talking to the council. We've never been in that situation, though. Yeah. Yeah. And it may happen. I just hope I don't live that long. But that's always a possibility. That was a possibility in Rome when Paul was telling them these things. A consideration they had to take into account, and ultimately, they've got a conscience they have to deal with also, which we get into chapter 14. Let me move on. I know there's about a gazillion questions and comments and opinions, but what it boils down to is what Paul and Peter both said. That is, if we respect God, we respect the government. We talked about the Pax Romana. We talked about Roman law. So there were some good things that came out, but there was still a terrible situation. We talked about what Isaiah says about Cyrus. Isaiah prophesied from about 740 to 700 BC. We don't know when this prophecy was written, but it was written in that time frame. And he names the Persian king who will send the Jews back to their homeland. When did Cyrus actually live? When did he actually send the Jews back to their homeland? What year? Do you have any idea? The Edict of Cyrus was 536. 200 years later is when this prophecy came true. Who is controlling government? God is controlling government. Use the whole empire to do his will. Now, verse 6, for because of you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due to them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Just part of respecting government. We pay taxes. And that's where we're paying taxes to things we don't like to pay for, and we don't want to pay for, and we don't think is right to do. But what did Paul say? We pay our taxes. What did Jesus say when they asked him about the poll tax to Caesar? He said, pay Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And on all of our currency, it says Federal Reserve note. So ultimately, we pay taxes. Now, we live in a country where we can express our displeasure about what the government's doing. And we don't have to fear the government punishing us for it. But that's really a very new situation with respect to culture and society. Never have people been able to do that. They talk against government, what's going to happen? What frequently happened was, but we live in a government where we expect to have the right to be critical. That doesn't change what the government says is our problem, and that doesn't change what the government requires us to pay. That was Jesus' point. If you honor government because you honor God, your taxes are due. And it doesn't really make any difference what the government is spending on it. The government is taxing it. Going on to verse 8. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled. This is where Paul is changing direction a little bit, and he's talking about our responsibilities with respect to the community. That is, those whom we live with respect to our society. Now, debt. His statement is, owe nothing to any man. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. That's kind of tough to do. But within the context and within the time, debt was different back then. Most of our debt is in what? Our mortgage that we owe to a bank, or those little plastic things we carry around in our purses and wallets. That's where most of our debt is. What we find in Roman times, or in the first century in which Paul is writing this, is we find that debt tended to be interpersonal. Look at Luke 16. And the first few verses of where the servant in charge of the household is required to is being held responsible for his job. But in Luke 16, give you an idea of the point that we're making is that verse 4, verse 3, the manager said to himself, what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig. I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. And he summoned, verse 5, and he summoned each of his master's debtors. Most of the debt that we see in early church times was personal debt. Person owed another person. Now, if you owe debt to a person, what does that debt do to your relationship with that person? Can it make it at times uncomfortable? Yes. So that's why Paul is saying, owe nothing to anyone, because sometimes debt gets in the way. Because you always have this obligation hanging over you. So the best way to handle that obligation is to not have the debt at all. Then you can freely interchange and talk with that person whom you are to love, as the law says. I may have seen a hand. Nope, good. So he talks about owe nothing to anyone. Now, is that a good principle for us? Even though Paul wrote it 2,000 years ago, even though debt was different 2,000 years ago, is that still a pretty good rule for us? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Because what does debt do? Keeps you awake at night, for one thing. What else does debt do? Debt sets your priority to your household expenses. What should be setting priority to your household expenses? What are we doing first day of every week that we prosper? We're contributing. And how are we to contribute? Cheerfully and liberally. And debt can impact that negatively. So we don't have debt the way they do. Typically we don't owe persons for money. We owe banks, we owe corporations, but there's nothing personal about them at all. They're just companies. But debt is still a problem, not only for the Christian 2,000 years ago, but for the Christian today. because it changes the way you look at the priorities of how you prosper. Now we're all gonna suffer debt. That's just part of living. If your heart is pumping, you owe a company money. That's one typically goes with the other. But to make it our goal not to be in debt, so that we truly can prioritize our contributing to the work of God, then becomes an objective that we all have. And it makes sense. It makes sense. Now, we're not so much concerned about getting rid of debt so that we can love our neighbor, because there's usually no debt between us and our neighbor that compounds that. But we still have the obligation, as Paul there says, to love our neighbor. He says in verse 9, as we read on, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. Where do those come from? 10 Commandments. That's 4 of the 10 Commandments, for example, that we find in Exodus chapter 20. But those are 4 commandments that deal with what? What's the purpose of those commandments? Community. They pertain to how we treat others and how we live amongst others, i.e., how we live with our neighbors. And he who loves his neighbors have fulfilled the law. Remember that if-then that we talked about? If we love God, then what? We love who? The neighbors. We love our neighbor. True statement? Yes, it is. If we therefore fail to love our neighbors, who are we failing to love? God. So we have to see that our daily personal life can very much impact our life with God. Because ultimately, that's the relationship that we're concerned about, is loving, respecting, honoring God. And how are we doing it? Well, one way is the government. Secondly, our neighbors. And we're going to find that there's other ways. But failure to do so impacts, ultimately, how we obey and honor God. Because that's what he expects. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is what? The fulfillment of the law. 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, it begins with the 10 Commandments. And God expects those, now that they're properly restated, God expects us to honor them as well. Mitch has set too high of a bar. I can't finish 5 minutes early like he does. Sabrina, did you have any comments along? Okay. Looks like we have technical difficulties. Galatians chapter 6. He says, Paul says, do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. Then in verse 10, so then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are the household of faith. So he's expecting from us our mindset, where our mind is on whom? Our brethren, our neighbor, and ultimately, because of that, our God. Did you have a comment, Randy? Or so we have the obligation to love, to honor, respect God, and respect his authority, and it's seen in several different ways. And it's seen in the ways that affect our relationship not only to the government, but to our neighbor as well, even the perfect stranger. And those is important that we honor. Luke chapter 10. And the lawyer stood up and put him to the test and saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit law? And he said to him, what is written? And the lawyer answers him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. There is a principle that Paul is talking about, and that is with respect to our person. Where is our attention? Is it on us? No, it's not. It's not on us. He expects us to honor neighbor. He expects us to honor brethren. He expects us to honor strangers. And matter of fact, he spoke of hospitality. The Greek word for hospitality is love of strangers. It's a compound word that begins with phileo, which is the root word for brotherly love, or just love of brothers or other people. In 1 Thessalonians, he says, now as to the love of the brethren, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves are taught by God to love one another. For indeed you do practice it toward all the brethren who are in Macedonia, but we urge you, brethren, to excel still more and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life and attend to your own business and work with your hands, just as we commanded you. Why do we, as he says, lead a quiet life and attend to your own business, working with our hands? What ultimately are we to do? So that you will behave properly toward outsiders and not be in any need. It's funny. We go to work. We go to work to support ourselves and our family. But ultimately, the way we go to work and the way we conduct ourselves is also to behave properly towards outsiders. We always have obligation to other people. God never talks about the obligation we have to ourselves. He talks about our obligation to God. He talks about our obligation to neighbors. He talks about our obligation to brethren. He talks about our obligation to strangers. But he never talks about what we're obligated to do for ourselves. Because our attention needs to be outside of ourselves and spent on others for the sake of the welfare of others. Hence the term love. And now I'm out of time. So I was hoping to get a little farther, but we'll rush through some of it next time. Thank you.